Good evening, everyone, brothers, sisters, and siblings. My name is Daniel Caves, and I'm the Justice of the Robert E. Redding National Capital Area Alumni Chapter of Phi Alpha Delta Law Fraternity International. Tonight is an exciting night for the Redding chapter and hopefully for all of P.A.D. This is the first installment of the Redding chapter's new Core Values Speaker Series, which is a new initiative of ours where once per quarter, we're going to present a speaker to our chapter and to all of P.A.D. to speak on a topic tied into one of Phi Alpha Delta's core values. To those of you who are new to P.A.D. or just want a refresher, our core values are compassion, courage, diversity, innovation, integrity, professionalism, and service. A trusted friend recently shared these words with me by academic Brene Brown. Integrity is choosing courage over comfort, choosing what is right over what is fun, fast, or easy, and practicing your values, not just professing them. How appropriate, then, that our inaugural value for this speaker series is integrity. And before I introduce our distinguished inaugural speaker, I would like to invite our current International Justice, John Karasik, to speak a few introductory words.
Thank you, Dan. What makes Phi Alpha Delta unique as a legal organization, as an organization of lawyers and law students and those who are of the law, is our commitment to our core values. Each of us has pledged our commitment to those values. That's what really makes us different from your local bar association, other clubs or association or organizations you may have joined in law school, other professional organizations you may become involved with. We have these core values because we believe that our commitment to those values that Dan just elucidated for us will elevate our profession and will elevate society as a whole. And for this reason, we believe that it's crucial for Phi Alpha Delta to articulate those values and to talk about those values and to program around those values as often as possible. So I congratulate the Redding chapter on this inaugural event in the speaker series focused on our core values. And with that, I'll turn the microphone back to Dan.
I think you're
Dan, you're muted.
I am muted. Thank you for that. Thank you, John. And now let me introduce our speaker for tonight. Derek Webb is a professor of law at the Catholic University of America's Columbus School of Law here in Washington, D.C. He also happens to be the faculty advisor for Cardozo chapter at CUA Law, as well as a member of that chapter. So welcome, Brother Webb. Professor Webb writes and teaches in the areas of constitutional law, the federal courts, civil and criminal procedure, legal history, and American political thought. He has published over 20 articles or essays in a broad array of law reviews and journals. Professor Webb has a BA in philosophy from Yale University, a PhD in political theory from the University of Notre Dame, and he has his JD from Georgetown University Law Center here in Washington, D.C., so you could also qualify as a member of Taft chapter. He has served as a senior research scholar at Yale Law School and as the Dean's Visiting Scholar at Georgetown Law. He's also practiced law at Sidley Austin for 5 years in Washington, D.C., and its Supreme Court and Appellate Practice Group. I could go on, and I probably should, but I will cap this biography off with saying that among his many other accolades, Professor Webb is now a research fellow at the George Washington Presidential Library at Mount Vernon here in the Washington, D.C. area. And I understand that it's also where he most recently gave a version of tonight's talk not too long ago. I look forward to hearing what Professor Webb has to say, and I hope you do too. So without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Brother Professor Derek Webb.
Great. Wow. Well, thank you, Daniel, and thank you, John, for those introductory remarks and for the invitation to be a part of this. I'm excited to get a chance to talk through with you a book project that I'm working on right now down at Mount Vernon. It's under a contract with Cambridge University Press. And the title of the book is The Spirit of Amity, the Constitution's Cover Letter and the Original Meaning of Civility. I think most of that got into the invitation for tonight's event as well. And John flagged the point about culture right up front in his opening remarks. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today is sort of constitutional culture. But before I get into that, let me make just a couple of kind of initial kind of prefatory remarks. First about P.A.D. It's been fun to be the advisor for Catholic University Law School's chapter. Taylor Talley sort of reached out to me to kind of be the kind of the advisor for it. I've had a lot of fun with it. We took a trip to the Supreme Court back in April with a ton of students. And I'm looking forward to being involved with more programming this upcoming year. I saw in the background, John has now done away with his camera, but in the background of John's room there, he had an image, there we go, of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And I did want to actually just lead off because we're all lawyers or aspiring lawyers. Before I get into deep constitutional history, I want to lead with something a little bit more current and lawyerly. And that is the relationship between Justice Ginsburg and Justice Scalia. And this idea, this concept of having conversations with and friendships across ideological differences. I think it's something that we struggle with today, as lawyers and as a country. And that's really the theme of my talk tonight. When I was working at the Supreme Court as a Supreme Court fellow, where I worked in the office of the Counselor to the Chief Justice, I had the opportunity to have lunch with both Justice Ginsburg and Justice Scalia separately on two separate occasions. With Justice Scalia, it was this big affair where we took a van to this Italian restaurant called Tosca near Ford's Theater. He was very excited about this event and was telling me he was really looking forward to the baby octopus that they had on offer there. We got there. Alas, the baby octopus was not available. The two waiters who were waiting on us very, very nervously were just, kind of aghast that they didn't have this for him. And so they brought out some complimentary calamari. At the end of it, we have a bottle of wine, or just four of us with Justice Scalia. And then at the end of this big, rich Italian lunch, he then orders some after dinner drink, a liqueur, grappa. And so he takes a big sip out of it and then he hands it to me and he said, okay, so I guess this is what we're doing. We're now like sipping out of each other's vials. So I took a very small sip of this grappa, very strong stuff. And he said, you've clearly not had grappa before. Give that a good shot. And he asked me to so I did another bigger shot. We are all then basically a little tipsy after our lunch with Justice Scalia. And we then, it's in wintertime, we then we leave the restaurant, we go into this van that's waiting outside. It's icy. I'm holding one arm of Justice Scalia, another fellow is holding another arm, and we kind of get into the van. We go back to the Supreme Court. He takes us into his chambers, and we're all kind of a little buzzed, hanging out with Justice Scalia, talking about constitutional law, Supreme Court history. He gave me the ultimate compliment of disagreeing with me at lunch, saying, "You can't possibly believe that." I thought that's exactly the kind of Scalia treatment I wanted to get in my interaction with him. Justice Ginsburg had a slightly different style. Hers was a more civilized and sedate and sober event where we met in her chambers. We had coffee, tea, cookies, various pastries, talked about opera. It was a lovely occasion. And as you may know, she was a big fan of opera. And in fact, there was an opera written about the relationship between Justice Scalia and Justice Ginsburg that I recommend checking out, written by a law student, actually, who had a musical background. And there's a nice origin story to the Justice Ginsburg, Justice Scalia friendship that I thought I'd relate to you if you haven't heard of it before. The first time Justice Ginsburg ever saw Justice Scalia in action, he was giving a talk at a conference. And she reports that she found herself disagreeing with just about everything he was saying, but she said that she loved the way he was saying it. And that was the birth of this beautiful friendship that the two of them had over decades of time, despite pretty significant kind of disagreements on the law and different perspectives on the world too. So that idea, though, that Justice Ginsburg articulates about like the way someone speaks, how someone talks, the mode of their operation is exactly what I'm talking about tonight, about the mode of discourse in a constitutional republic. And so my thesis is that at the American founding, which I get to go back to almost literally every day when I drive down to Mount Vernon, is that there were three legs to the stool of our constitutional system, our constitutional republic. The first leg was structure. It's the thing that Justice Scalia liked to emphasize a lot in his public talks. Constitutions are about structure. They're about separation of powers. They're about federalism. They're about the first four articles of the Constitution. The second leg of the stool was rights and rights protection. You find them, of course, in the Bill of Rights, and then they're articulated and applied to the states via the Reconstruction Amendments. But you look for them in the amendments in the Constitution. And in college and in law school, and we've all gone through both of those rites of passage or are going through them now, we present the study of the Constitution in terms of Con Law 1 and Con Law 2. Con Law 1 is structure, Con Law 2 is rights. And a century of scholarship has been written both about structural questions and about rights questions. And I can go into that in great detail with regard to the bibliography. But my argument is that at the founding, there was a third leg of the stool that a lot of people, I think, have sort of lost touch with a little bit, which was this idea of constitutional culture, not just structure, not just rights, but culture, which spoke to the mode in which people kind of spoke with each other, which the founders themselves regarded as kind of indispensable, and in the long run, even more important than the rights that are enumerated in the Bill of Rights, and even more important than structure. It's an insight that other jurists in the 19th and 20th centuries famously articulated. Alexis de Tocqueville, if you pick up Democracy in America, he says that explicitly, that the mores of a culture, how we relate to each other privately, and is more important in the long run than getting the right structure or getting the right judges into the right courts. Same with Learned Hand, who gave a very, very famous address right at the tail end of World War II in Central Park, where he said that liberty lies in the hearts of men and women. And if it dies there, no courts, no laws, no constitutions can save us. So this idea, this focus on sort of what is in our hearts or what is in our minds as citizens and as lawyers has got a lot of attention from those two key figures in the 19th and 20th century. So also at the founding, and very much so. And like a good lawyer, presenting a little argument, and I love Cortland's background there with the Supreme Court. I feel like I'm making an argument there. But lawyers like to have textual hooks. And as I said, the first leg of the stool, structure, is Articles 1 through 5, or maybe all the articles of the, Articles 1 through 7 of the Constitution speak to the structure of our system. The rights protections are obviously protected. You go forward into the Bill of Rights or into the Reconstruction Amendments or the Progressive Era, Modern Era Amendments. My textual hook for this idea of constitutional culture, which I'll elaborate more in my talk, is a little known and forgotten, and I just recently discovered, totally lost, cover letter or transmittal letter to the Constitution. It was a letter that was signed by George Washington on September 17, 1787. And so I'm calling it, with a bit of poetic license, the Constitution's cover letter. It wasn't called that, it was called the transmittal letter. And it was often printed, it was always printed with the Constitution. So anybody who was picking this thing up in 1787 would have read not only, the articles, but they would have also read this cover letter. Oftentimes it was printed on the back side of a broadsheet, but sometimes it was actually printed literally right in front. So it was, the first page part would be here, and then the Constitution would start going. And so it was, ordinary citizens would have been reading this before they even got to "We the people do ordain and establish." You would have gotten this letter. It's a short letter. You can read it in a few minutes. I recommend everybody do it at some point. It's very short. But there's one key paragraph from this letter that I do want to, if you don't mind me reading from. It's just a few sentences, but it kind of helps frame our conversation. And so here it is. This is George Washington on behalf of the Constitutional Convention. In all our deliberations on this subject, we kept steadily in our view that which appears to us the greatest interest of every true American, the consolidation of our Union, in which is involved our prosperity, felicity, safety, perhaps our national existence. This important consideration, seriously and deeply impressed on our minds, led each state in the convention to be less rigid on points of inferior magnitude than might have been otherwise expected. And here's the key line. And thus this Constitution, which we now present, is the result of a spirit of amity and of that mutual deference and concession, which the peculiarity of our political situation rendered indispensable. And so the man who was often considered the indispensable man at the founding, who beat the British against all odds and then was sort of unanimously considered the obvious choice for president once the system got going, that indispensable man considered the spirit of amity, A-M-I-T-Y, to be indispensable to the creation of the Constitution in Philadelphia. And he was also then obviously hoping that that spirit would prevail also in the state ratifying conventions going forward. And if you know much about Washington's career after the Constitution was framed, it becomes a theme throughout his kind of presidency too. He uses this phrase often, all the way up to his farewell address in 1796. Just a couple words about the drafting of this document. This document was actually written by the Committee of Style. It's a group of 5 members of the convention who were asked to write a letter that would, quote, accompany the Constitution. And so in their mind, they would have the Constitution, but then they would also have this letter that ordinary citizens and politicians in the states would read together. They read it aloud in Philadelphia, paragraph by paragraph, and debated it. And they voted as a convention. The entire convention voted on this. So this was not just a letter that Washington kind of like dashed off, on his own or had somebody else write on his behalf. This was something that the delegates sort of, just as they voted on the Constitution, they also voted on this letter that was supposed to accompany this Constitution. This is not an originalist type argument, but sometimes when you think about originalism, sometimes the evidence for originalist claims can be a little bit spotty. You're not sure that something really actually was said. Mary Bilder from Boston College has written this wonderful book called Madison's Hand, where she shows that actually James Madison edited his own notes from the Constitutional Convention for decades after the convention took place. Query whether like that was accurately reflecting exactly what was said, or maybe it was more what he wanted to have said, perhaps. But here we know for sure, like there's no problem with the provenance of this document. We know that that's what they sort of agreed upon. And it didn't just represent one guy's perspective, Washington or Madison or Hamilton or Jefferson. It represented kind of a consensus view of the people in Philadelphia. And what's interesting is that it was not only something that like the people in Philly agreed upon, but when you look at the state ratifying conventions, the year-long big debate about the Constitution that begins in 1787 and concludes in 1788, it's pretty much one of the most cited documents during this entire ratifying debate. Far more often cited and referred to than even the Federalist Papers. And that might surprise you because today we think, of course, the Federalist Papers were kind of, what everybody was picking up and reading. That only became true well after the creation of the Constitution. The Federalist Papers only grew in significance as time went on. But the Constitution's cover letter receded in significance at its high point in 1787 and 1788, when everybody was citing it and referring to the Spirit of Amity. And then it kind of like faded, it kind of faded away. Um, I'm now going through pretty much every book that has been written on the creation of the Constitution to kind of see references to it. And there are really very few scholars who have spent any time at all. They will mention it, but they don't really kind of explore its significance or its meaning or how often it was cited. Pocket constitutions, for instance, that also not only have the Constitution, but might have like other important state papers like the Articles of Confederation or the Declaration of Independence or the Gettysburg Address. I've never seen in the 250 plus year history of America since the Declaration a single pocket constitution bundling, including this cover letter, even though Washington had it in his mind and all the delegates had it in their mind that it should accompany the Constitution. And I've recently just discovered, and I'm pretty much floored by this, that the National Archives used to have this document, the original, handwritten cover letter. It was written by likely Gouverneur Morris. We don't know for sure, but he was the head of the Committee of Style. He wrote most of the Constitution itself and the preamble of the Constitution. And Max Ferrand has said that he thought it was in his handwriting. And the National Archives used to have it, and now apparently it's lost it somehow. It's truly like something right out of national treasure. We need Nicolas Cage to go in and like find this document. Like how did this get lost or stolen? And that's part of what I'm working on actually, is looking into that question too. But not only has it been forgotten by judges and scholars, I mean, I run into Supreme Court advocates who've argued 15, 20 big Supreme Court cases, and I'll mention to them the Constitution's cover letter, and they'll have never heard of it. But so not only has it been metaphorically forgotten and lost, it literally is lost. I mean, we do have, thankfully, lots and lots and lots of newspaper printings of it from that time period, so we know exactly what was in it, but we've lost the actual original document. But what a symbol for this, which is that I feel like this letter and the concepts in it have really been, in a way, sort of lost to history. And what I'm trying to do in my book is to not only kind of detail the documentary history of it and kind of even see what we can do about finding the thing, but also trying to unpack from the founders' perspectives, who were, by the way, of course, not saints in any way, and I'll talk about that a lot, but from their perspective, what was their understanding of this idea of the spirit of amity, this indispensable kind of concept that they thought was indispensable to the Constitution? And so what I'm going to walk through, are the three dimensions of the spirit of amity, three concepts of the spirit of amity that I think Washington and Federalists and Anti-Federalists alike kind of agreed upon. And then I'm going to conclude with some thoughts about some practical implications or significance of that, maybe for us today, in thinking about this as lawyers and as citizens. Okay, so the first dimension of the spirit of amity was a social dimension. Sometimes we think about the founders as focused on a sort of having a very Lockean, individualist, atomistic view of human nature. That there are these kind of individuals, and they have their rights, and their rights need to be protected against all comers, and that's why government comes into existence to protect their rights. But boy, they had such a rich understanding of the way in which the social person is connected to like the reasoning person, the individual, the delegate who might have to sort of vote for a constitution. So, for instance, at the Philadelphia Constitutional Convention, not only were they debating with each other from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. every day, they were also boarding with each other in a handful of hotels and homes, private homes, all around the kind of the Philadelphia area. So they were spending a ton of time physically with each other. When the convention would wrap up around 4 p.m., they would then have dinner, and they formed dinner clubs. You might say like prototypes of sort of like fraternities, legal fraternities, where they would meet together in convivial social settings. And they made a point of having them be cross-sectional so that people from the eastern states, Massachusetts and New York, would be interacting with people from South Carolina and Georgia on purpose to sort of get people acquainted with each other. And then after these dinner parties would wrap up, they would all then have like tea parties at other private homes around Philadelphia. Um, Again, just spending time talking with each other, sitting down with each other, getting to know each other outside the context of the heated debates in the convention, but interacting with each other as humans, as flesh and blood people. And they were definitely flesh and blood. They ate a lot and they drank a lot. And eating and drinking was frankly, a very basic but big part of the way the Constitution got created and got ratified. And people would often say that party animosities were diffused at the social table. It's a phrase that I've sort of seen in one of the newspapers I picked up. When they were celebrating the Constitution, they just had 55 bottles of Madeira. There's a receipt that I have from the city tavern that just ridiculous amount of booze and food that they were kind of having, including what George Washington called breakage. They were getting so excited that they, I think, broke some things at the city tavern. I also recently learned they would go on fishing trips to the Schuylkill River and other areas kind of nearby Philadelphia. So they're spending social time with each other. On top of the social piece, there were these important parliamentary rules of procedure that they really kind of emphasize in the Philly Convention. I'm sure you're familiar with some of them. Like, for instance, they did have a sort of a ban on sort of leaking information to the press. They required that when anybody was speaking during the convention, nobody could read a pamphlet or have a side conversation. You really had to actually sit there and listen to the person speak. No one could speak twice before any other member who had something to say could speak once. And they did not keep an official record of the votes. So they wanted to make sure that people felt free to change their minds and switch their votes. And there was a fair amount of vote switching. And now that James Madison in particular emphasized how much people's minds were changing and how good a thing that was, that people were open to persuasion. And I'll get to that more in my second point after the social piece. Find a little piece about this, that so much of the actual work at the convention was done by committees. Committees staffed and populated by known moderates. Whenever you read the Constitutional Convention, you think of the big people like James Madison and Alexander Hamilton and James Wilson, these kind of big theoretical people, people who like to speak a lot and argue. But the people who actually got stuff done were a little bit more backbenchers or quieter people who were more moderate and were willing to try to find a way to kind of broker compromise. So that kind of unique confluence of parliamentary rules and social practices and a kind of a spirit that prevailed made it possible to get to yes on the Constitution. And George Washington, as he came home on September 17th, wrote in his diary, the business being thus closed, the members adjourned to the city tavern, dined together, and took cordial leave of each other. After which I returned to my lodgings, did some business with and received the papers from the Secretary of the Convention, and retired to meditate on the momentous work which had been executed. And Washington and Madison and others who had been there felt this was a miracle, that we actually, out of all the discordant views at the time, managed to kind of broker a compromise of some kind and get this Constitution together. But now I want to pivot, because the spirit of amity that had prevailed maybe during the Constitutional Convention and Madison and Washington celebrated on September 17th did not really last much more than a week. In Philadelphia, things went bad quickly. The Pennsylvania State Assembly was racing to be the first state to ratify the Constitution to improve their chances of getting the capital located in, guess where? Philadelphia. And so in order to kind of move that along, they decided to force a vote on the date for the election of delegates to the Pennsylvania state ratifying Constitution. But already there was a developing set of critics of the Constitution, people who were like looking askance at this newfangled document. There were a few people, as you know, at the Philadelphia Convention who didn't sign the document, like George Mason and Edmund Randolph. And they wrote letters that became pretty popular. And they were sort of the seed out of which this anti-federalist party started to kind of slowly form. So these anti-federalists in Pennsylvania were not loving the effort by the Pennsylvania Federalists to kind of push this down on them so quickly and to force a vote. And so they decided, using an age-old parliamentary trick, they decided they would just not show up at the Pennsylvania State Assembly when they had when the last day of their session, when they were then going to vote to set a date for the convention and for the election for the convention. So they just stayed at home. They didn't show up. The Federalists were not deterred by this. They did another age-old thing, which was to go to these people's homes, knock on their doors initially. There was one story of a woman who came to the door and she asked who they were looking for. They said, we're looking for one of the delegates, the convention. She goes upstairs, is there for a few minutes. There's some muffled conversation. She comes down and says, sorry, no one's here. But the Federalists would not be sort of satisfied by that. And they literally broke down doors of the Anti-Federalists and took these men and dragged them through the streets of Philadelphia and brought them against their will into the Pennsylvania State Assembly in the room right above where the Constitution had been signed just a week before. An angry kind of mob basically kept them there, even though they wanted to leave the room. The Pennsylvania speaker said, all right, we've got a quorum now, and gavelled it in, had the vote, and set the date. This was not an auspicious start to how things would sort of operate in Pennsylvania, and things only went down from there. In the press, people were starting to offer kind of critiques of the Constitution, of this new system. Like, where did this convention get the idea that they had the authority to propose this whole new reworking of our system? We only authorized them to tinker with the Articles of Confederation. So one particularly kind of strong critic named Tar and Feathers wrote back and said, any critic of the Constitution should be prepared to be treated the way enemies to the American Revolution, loyalists, were treated a decade ago, with a tar and feathering, with basically physical torture and physical intimidation. They also then, Federalists started to get a little bit more savvy. Instead of physical threats to Anti-Federalists, a number of printing presses refused to publish the writings of critics of the Constitution unless they left their name with the printer. As you may know, the practice at that point was to write with pseudonyms like Brutus or Federal Farmer or Publius for a lot of reasons. But one of the reasons was if you were against the Constitution, you didn't want to like hack off and annoy all the kind of big moneyed interests who might be your customers or your employers, and so there was a self-protective dimension to the pseudonyms. But Federalist printers refused to publish Anti-Federalist essays unless they left their names with the printers. Another form of intimidation. The Federalists simply just did not think that the farmers and mechanics and tradesmen from the western parts of Pennsylvania and other parts of the country deserved to be argued with. Who are you, dumb farmer, they would basically say, to to question the wisdom of Benjamin Franklin, the most famous man in the world, or George Washington, the most celebrated man in America, who, this was, and the way the Anti-Federalists were kind of talked about those arguments was that the Federalists were conjuring with the magic of names. They were just making an argument from authority. And the Anti-Federalists did not love this, but they lost ultimately in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania did ratify. They weren't the first state, but they became the state in mid-December of 1787 to ratify the Constitution on a total party line vote. The Federalists did not allow the Anti-Federalists to publish their dissenting opinions in the journal of the State Assembly, hardly let them debate at all, just rammed it down their throats, and they had the votes. And they got the win. They ratified this thing in Pennsylvania, but they absolutely alienated half the state, and frankly, more than half the state were annoyed with this behavior. And it absolutely fed a feeling of resentment and anger towards the Federalists that they would pay for months afterwards. Soon after the Pennsylvania State Assembly ratifies the Constitution, there are some Federalists who are partying, celebrating the big victory in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, which is not too far from Gettysburg. And a group of anti-federalists were annoyed with this behavior, and they decided to descend upon these revelers and beat them with like clubs and sticks and hammers, and nearly killed one person. It was a huge melee. Um, a number of these guys were then rounded up and arrested, and then over 1,000 like militia people from the middle part of of Pennsylvania descended on Carlisle, demanding the release of what they call political prisoners from the jail in Pennsylvania, and they actually did spring them from the jail. Um, and then the Pennsylvania Anti-Federalists got about 6,000 signatures to undo the Pennsylvania Ratifying Convention. They said it was totally illegitimate. It happened, but it was illegitimate. So George Washington is observing all of this, and he is, first and foremost, a strategist about, military affairs, and a strategist about kind of national security and building this country. And he's looking on at this and saying, this is no way to persuade our fellow citizens. You need to reason with the people you disagree with a certain degree of moderation and candor and fairness and even gentleness. This is just not going to work. You might get the win, but it won't be perceived as legitimate. And the rule of law and the Constitution hinges ultimately on broad social acceptance of the Constitution. And so if it's just rammed down on a party line vote with these hardline tactics, it's not going to enjoy the long-term kind of legitimacy, perceived legitimacy that we need it to have. That was his sort of key insight. He was not a man of letters, as you may know, himself, but he urged the people who were, like Madison and Hamilton, to write the Federalist Papers and distributed the Federalist Papers whenever he could. And so that helps me pivot to the second prong of the spirit of amity. So the first is social, especially when you're talking about conventions or small groups of people in rooms. The parliamentary procedures and the food and the drink and the conviviality and the sociality was a big part of not only the Philly Convention, but a lot of other state ratifying conventions later. But it wasn't enough. It was not enough to actually get the thing done. The second thing they had to learn on the fly, because they were doing this they were, creating the plane as they flew it, was how to talk with each other across not just, with 55 people in a room or 7 people in a room, but across, at that point, 3 million citizens who were, reading the thing in newspapers, talking about it in bars and taverns and coffee houses. How do we do that? And Americans had not really done that before. And I think that is something that's interesting to think about when we talk about American exceptionalism. Sometimes that's a crazy concept, but I think there you can, at least you see from their standpoint, they thought this was a momentous moment. This was a moment where, for the first time in American history, and maybe even in world history, a bunch of people, a huge landmass, people in a big landmass with a lot of differences of perspectives, had the opportunity to vote on a constitution, vote on a new government, not just by force or violence or war, but establish a new government on the basis of reason and reflection and kind of persuasion. And my thesis on this point is that it was actually the critics of the Constitution, the losers in the debate, the anti-federalists, who were really actually the vanguard for thinking through step by step how to think about a public sphere with a large array of people who have diverse perspectives, how to kind of think about the Constitution and write about and talk about and debate with each other whether to have a Constitution. And so they developed slowly but surely this theory of the public sphere. Because the Federalists don't really want to debate, and the Anti-Federalists very much do want to have a debate. And the first kind of point that they emphasize over and over again, I think it's just a beautiful thought. And this, I think, aligns with the value of integrity quite closely, hopefully, which is this idea of thinking for yourself. They had just gotten off an American Revolution where they fought on behalf of this idea that all men are created equal, and that no man is born a leader, born booted, ready to ride, or others born with saddles on their backs. And they fought this bloody, hard war for years against England to vindicate that point. And now they're looking and seeing, oh my gosh, these Federalists expect us just to sort of hand our brains over to them because they are lawyers and they're wealthy and they're well-to-do, and we're not so fancy. But the same principles that animated the American Revolution, they said, should also animate this new debate, this new battle, not a physical battle, not with fighting, but with reason and with argument and persuasion. And the first principle, the first right and the first duty of a citizen of the Constitution, under the Constitution, was to think for yourself. It also had a kind of Protestant vibe to it, I think, as well, for sure. I think you see that in the writings. Um, but but okay, so to think for yourself, that sounds great, and it was a duty they thought people had. But how to do that? How to do that well? And so um, over the course of hundreds of pamphlets, they talk about how can citizens, ordinary, merchants and blacksmiths and farmers, think for themselves about this tricky thing about, whether to build a new constitution. And so they had a number of ideas and points, and I'm going to walk you through them just quickly. The first is the idea of time. People can't immediately and quickly kind of size up something complicated like the Constitution, in 30 seconds or in even a day. They requested regularly, over and over again, we need a pause, a solemn pause, a few months to think about this and read this thing, because it's complicated and we need to spend some time. I think that's a nice thing to think about in our own political moment when you want sort of immediate political response to anything right off the bat. That might not be the best recipe for the most thoughtful kind of product. And the reason, anyway, they thought they needed time was because the Constitution, they said every sentence, word, even the letter, like a single comma or semicolon, for sure, had significance, had meaning. And so we needed to kind of just take our time and study this thing. And so you see these guys over and over again saying, I've read this thing now 3 times. I'm sick of this Constitution. I've read it so many times. But that was something that I thought was necessary. If you want to be a part of the public's debate, you need to actually kind of do the work and kind of like read the thing and think about it. Another thing, a huge point that unified all their perspectives was that public debate needed to be focused on the truth, on the acquisition of truth, that there were facts out there in the world that needed to be ascertained. And people could, obfuscate and lie about the facts, but it was important as a matter of sort of politics to sort of get people to focus on truth as the kind of the object of political discourse. One of the anti-federalists named Federal Farmer said, it is too often the case in political concerns that men state facts not as they are, but as they wish them to be. And so politics needed to be based on kind of hard, objective kind of truth and facts. And that was kind of the goal too. Another huge theme for the anti-federalists for thinking about America's public sphere was moderation. And when we think about moderation, we think about maybe like finding the middle point in between 2 extremes and sort of going there, or maybe the kind of the mushy middle between 2 positions. For them, moderation had a completely different meaning. It meant really independence of thought, that you were not beholden to one political party or another as you're thinking about, about the Constitution. This was not to say that parties couldn't be good. They did think that parties could be useful to the new country. One anti-federalist wrote that the preservation of parties, public liberty depends. Whenever men are unanimous on great public questions, whenever there is but one party, freedom ceases and despotism commences. The object of a free and wise people should be so to balance parties that from the weakness of all you may be governed by the moderation of the combined judgments of the whole, not tyrannized over by the blind passions of a few individuals. So, contrast some scholars who think the founders were not even aware of parties or anticipated parties. They knew that parties were there. They were there during the debate over the Constitution itself, and they saw their value. But what they wanted to avoid at all costs was what they called the spirit of party, that you were already sort of like locked into your position just by virtue of your party affiliation with one group or another, with the anti-federalists or the federalists, the Republicans or the Democrats. They wanted you, above all, to be independent-minded. Another point is that, and connected with that, was they needed people to hear both sides. Both sides of the argument needed to be heard and processed. As one anti-federalist wrote, you ought to hear both sides as the man who determines on hearing one party only will almost always be mistaken in his judgment. He may be in the right, but it will be by chance and not by reason. So you only actually get to know something really if you've heard both sides and can respond to them. The metaphor that they used often for public debate was the idea of a furnace. The furnace needed to be hot. You needed to have a really intense, hard discussion about the merits of whatever you were talking about. And so you need to heat it up and throw in as much factual input and as many perspectives offered by the most sophisticated articulators of positions as you possibly could. So that was the idea of a furnace. However, they did not want the furnace to be so hot that it would incinerate the people who participated in it. And so again and again, there's a huge theme in the Federalist literature and anti-Federalist literature about avoiding ad hominem attack. It's very important for the debate to be fiery and intense and rigorous, but you need to be hard on the arguments in pursuit of the truth, not hard on each other. And of course, there was tons of ad hominem abuse at that time. It's actually quite funny, some of the language that they used to describe each other, of course, as you maybe imagine. But they thought it was actually a matter of first principle that the arguments be focused on the merits of the arguments rather than on the people who were making those arguments. For them, it ultimately it did not matter. It was irrelevant to the truth of the argument, who was making the argument and the quality of their character.
Professor, I think we lost your audio there.
Oh, yeah. I think I also lost your audio too. I wasn't sure if it was me.
Huh.
Oh, you're back. You're back.
Back now? Okay, sorry about that. Okay. I was just saying, if they basically argued that if you had that furnace approach to thinking about public discourse, truth would out in the end. And for them, the Constitution's legitimacy ultimately hinged on a thorough and free public discussion. In the end, the Federalists ultimately, kind of figured things out and responded in turn. And they made an argument which they called an argument open to all that would sort of respond point for point with the arguments that the anti-Federalists had raised. And so when you look at the ratifying debates, you see that there's a combination. There's really low lows. You have riots in the streets. You have people fighting each other and calling each other terrible names. But you also get higher highs. You get the output, the production of the Federalist Papers and the Anti-Federalists that was kind of made possible by this understanding of a public sphere in which arguments from both sides needed to be heard, and considered. I know Dave, how are we doing on time? I'm aware that I'm probably running up on our time.
We're about 5 minutes away from 8 p.m., but if you're okay with going beyond that, I don't know that.
I have a few more things to say, and I'm sorry I've taken a little longer than I perhaps should have. I can wrap up with my third point, the third and final kind of dimension of the Spirit of Amity, which I do think might be helpful to kind of talk through. The third piece just is that, just like sociality and eating and drinking with your friend, your debate partners was not enough to get to a yes. Neither was a great set of arguments. Hamilton himself noted, gosh, we make all these arguments and they confound our opponents, but they don't persuade them. We need something more than just pure reason or just food and drink. And that third piece was what Washington really was anchoring on, which was this idea of the spirit of amity or concession or mutual deference. Today, the word compromise is not exactly a word of praise for politicians on the left or the right, but at that time, the idea of compromise was definitely something that they thought was absolutely indispensable for a country which, as Washington put it, given the peculiarity of our political situation, was sort of indispensable. And you can go through kind of the key stages of the Constitution: creation, ratification, and amendment with the Bill of Rights. And this concept of the spirit of amity or conciliation, comes up again and again. In Philadelphia, you have the grand, compromise when it comes to the ratio of representation. In the state ratifying conventions, you don't get to yes unless a bunch of moderate critics of the Constitution, a moderate anti-federalist, switch positions in Massachusetts and in Virginia and New York and decide to abandon their political party and come over to the other side, like Edmund Randolph or John Hancock or Samuel Adams or Melancton Smith, people whose names have also been sort of more or less lost to history, I guess, except for maybe Sam Adams. But these were kind of our earliest profiles in courage, who in some cases sacrificed their political careers to kind of come over to the other side. Same with the Bill of Rights. I mean, the Bill of Rights is, our kind of one of our great founding charters, but James Madison was initially, and Alexander Hamilton were both very strongly opposed to the concept of the Bill of Rights. It was Thomas Jefferson who kind of persuaded Madison to give it another look. And Madison saw the Bill of Rights as a way to ameliorate the critics of the Constitution to the Constitution. And he particularly wanted to get North Carolina, who had held out from ratifying the Constitution, to kind of come over. So at every kind of key moment in the Constitution's early creation, this kind of spirit of amity prevails. And what I think is actually quite interesting about this concept of the spirit of amity or concession or deference was that even though these guys were people of the Enlightenment, inspired by the idea that the human mind could grasp truth and figure it out under the right circumstances, they also had a pretty healthy skepticism about reason. And the Federalist Papers, Federalist 1, Federalist 37, Federalist 85, are there are a lot of meditations on the ways in which the human mind can go wrong. We make mistakes all the time. And Hamilton begins his famous Federalist Papers in Federalist 1 by saying, there are so many biases to human judgment, so many reasons why the human mind can go wrong, that when you're in a big, intense public debate, and there's one side and another side, don't be so quick to assume that the people who are on your side got there because of, by virtue of kind of honor or integrity or virtue. Just because their opinions align with you doesn't mean their character is necessarily sort of spotless and pure. So also with your opposition, the people with whom you find yourself in disagreement, just because they have come to a different perspective than you on this matter, doesn't speak to their character. It speaks to their judgment and maybe their flawed judgment, but not to like who they are as humans. And he called this grounds for a lesson of moderation, that we should not sort of approach politics, like sort of this Manichaean battle between good and evil. And the more we see in the people with whom we disagree, grounds of sort of compromise and concession, the more likely we are to sort of, hold this country together. Those were the three elements that kind of course through this year-long debate about the Constitution: the sociality, the intellectual dimension, and this point about moderation. Let me just conclude, if I can, with just a couple thoughts about the kind of the practical implications for all this. I know this is a lot of history, and some of you might be interested in it. Others are like, what is all this history? Help us with. I think the history kind of shows that, this concept of the spirit of amity has fallen out of our political discourse and our legal discourse, I think, to our detriment. And sometimes when we talk about moderation or civility in public life, we tend to think in terms of just kumbaya values. Like it would be nice if we could be nice to each other, but we just simply can't because it's a big fight. And I think what George Washington, the great strategist, had to say about all this is that these virtues were eminently practical and indispensable, as he put it. The first piece is just, the first reason why it's sort of practical is because our country was uniquely created on this idea of a ratification by we, the people. And if that was going to kind of work out practically, we, the people, needed to be well equipped to actually think think well about the Constitution, think sort of helpful and reason well about the Constitution. It was sort of a matter of, Jurisprudentially, it's interesting to think about the Constitution being created by higher law, created as higher law by virtue of kind of popular conventions. But that thing doesn't happen without people also, being well equipped to kind of make that happen, to do that well. So for that reason, it was practical. But second, maybe even more importantly, after the moment when you get a constitution created or a piece of legislation created or a bylaw or an organization or whatever you're fighting over, you then still have to, you're confronted with the fact that you're going to have to live with each other again. And so this underlines this point about comity, C-O-M-I-T-Y, that there are no permanent victories like in politics or in law. You win one day, but you still have to sort of live with and work with the people with whom you're battling. You see that played out existentially at the Supreme Court over the course of a lifetime. And you see, I mentioned Justice Scalia earlier and his lovely friendship with Justice Ginsburg, but I think it's a matter of historical record that he also likely alienated some members of the Supreme Court by being a little too tough on them in his dissenting opinions, and probably lost some votes he might not have lost had he been a little bit more civil or more inspired by the spirit of amity. George Washington, in his farewell address, talks about his worry that democracy could end. And how could it end? By going into cycles of partisan revenge, where one party gets power and then just seeks revenge on the other losing party. But guess what? That losing party then comes back the next election and then takes revenge on the other party. And then over and over again until Americans, he said, or people would just get so exhausted by this whole theater that they would give up on democracy altogether and hand it over to kind of a strong man or a despot. So it again had a kind of practical significance. And the third and final point is a point about national security or the geopolitical significance of all of this. Panning out beyond our domestic sphere, George Washington saw the spirit of amity as indispensable to what he called perhaps our national existence, is the language he used in the cover letter. And by that, I think he had in mind France and Spain and England, who would love nothing more than to see this new fledgling country divided bitterly between eastern states and southern states, or between federalists and anti-federalists. That would be manna from heaven for our political enemies. And for him, it was helpful to have political parties. He grudgingly kind of came to that conclusion, but he saw when it came to kind of geopolitical concerns, which he more than really anybody else at the Constitutional Convention had his eye on, this spirit of amity was sort of indispensable to presenting, not only allowing for a creation of a new idea, not only of a Republican or a Democrat or a Federalist or an anti-Federalist, but an American who would have certain kind of ways of sort of relating to others and an ability to kind of like unite vis-a-vis at least the external world. So that is, those are my comments. I'm happy to talk about more contemporary applications of all this, of course, too. But I'm trying to kind of work through this historical concept, which I think has been literally and physically lost and metaphorically lost too. And happy to kind of respond to any questions, comments that you might have. But thanks for your patience.
Thank you, Professor Webb. I think that was an invitation for anyone who wants to ask some questions. So either you can drop them in the chat, or if you would like to raise your hand in the Zoom room and ask it yourself, that would be great too. But anyone?
Yes, please, John.
So I can't help but think of Katharine Graham. She was, in addition to being the publisher of the Washington Post, she was famously a host, and her dinner parties were kind of the last time in our history when you would have these large bipartisan social gatherings, and we haven't had that for several decades now, and I wonder if there is a pathway back to that kind of social interaction, to address the first point that you raised.
I love that point, and I think that's right. And I think people who really study Congress talk about this too, how the, the travel schedules of congressmen today, just in terms of congressmen anyway, pretty much prohibit that kind of social interaction. They are here back in DC, a few days out of the week, mainly just to sort of vote on things, and then they go home to their, constituents, and so they're literally not, physically spending much time with each other. And I think that, that probably has contributed to kind of the uptick in sort of at least seemingly sort of incivility between kind of the rival political parties in Washington, D.C. And, I've lived in D.C. for a decade, and I'm not aware of a lot of sort of roaring bipartisan parties, not only with congressmen or senators, but with kind of public intellectuals on the left and the right. And speaking about an area I know a little bit better, like law school world, typically, it's, I hate to say it, but it does seem there is more of a social alienation on law school campuses. It doesn't seem to me that there's a lot of intermixing on law school campuses between people who see the world differently with each other. They'll hang out with the American Constitution Society or the Federalist Society, but there aren't a lot of umbrella organizations which can allow people who do see the world differently or the law differently to nonetheless hang out and not have to debate, for 30 minutes or an hour and talk about something else while eating and drinking and talking about their families. And it's not to be like kumbaya, I used that word earlier, to say that just because you interact socially with people, you'll find yourself in agreement with them. And I have a wonderful friend I've known for decades, and I don't think I've persuaded him of anything over this time. We've had multiple meals, but I think you do at least stand in the way of feeling differently about that person after you've, spent some time with them and had dinner with them or had a drink with them. You might not agree with them, but you'll at least see them differently. And that can go a long way to at least easing some of the kind of the hyper partisanship, I think, in our legal culture and in our political culture too. So thank you, John. I mean, it's a good point. And I would love to see more of that happen in law schools. And I do think P.A.D is a great ideal sort of, organization to try to make that sort of thing happen.
Cora?
I think is a question.
Yeah, Cora.
Question in. And thank you for a really interesting talk. And it's so interesting that kind of the cover letter of the Constitution has kind of fallen into the shadows a bit of the greater document itself. I'm curious. Have you noticed if there are any kind of linguistic parallels between the cover letter and Washington's farewell address? Washington's farewell address being very well known, and then also being, I think, interestingly, the longest standing tradition in the Senate of being read annually since the Civil War, kind of similarly trying to sow this idea of amity or at least unity from partisanship.
Definitely. Yes. I think, well, and also it's good to think about sort of who wrote the farewell address in terms of the mechanics of it. And it's, to me, it's fascinating actually, because the farewell address was effectively written by Alexander Hamilton, but then there was an earlier draft written by James Madison and by John Jay. So the farewell address is actually like the 86th Federalist paper. It's like the last Federalist paper. And it's this grand thing. They worked on it for like basically 3 or 4 years. I mean, Washington was also eager to get back to Mount Vernon and like quit all this. And so he was constantly, the proverbial having your resignation letter in the desk. He had that for his basically entirety of his second administration. He doesn't use the phrase, the spirit of amity, in that letter. He does use it in a number of other letters and addresses he gives through the 1790s. But it's, to me, it's obvious that, I mean, one of the key themes of the farewell address is this idea about union and unity and being, finding common ground as Americans across disagreement. And he also links that to geopolitical concerns very clearly as well. That the only thing that can really undermine us as a country, we have so much going for us. I mean, they're already looking west and they're seeing like, we've got this made. We've got this amazing land. And we've got a pretty unique opportunity to kind of build this well and avoid so many of the problems that the European countries have fallen into for millennia. Um, but the thing that can trip us up will be self-inflicted wounds. And the thing that will, in particular, that was on his mind was, I think, this idea of um, the spirit of party and partisanship. That's a huge theme in the farewell address, and it's a theme in his cover letter as well. And in fact, in between those two documents, he also writes a letter a year after in 1788 where he riffs on the spirit of amity and draws out how it's the antithesis of party spirit. He was already kind of worried about that. But partisanship and party spirit was something that he was very concerned about. And to him, that was the key, that was the Achilles heel of America's democracy. That it's possible that could be the thing that would lead us, to undermine our chances for success. So yeah, I see them completely on a continuum. And the farewell address is a deeper, richer, for sure, meditation than my little cover letter. It's a short and sweet thing. The farewell address was like 6,000 words long. But I see them as sort of, essays that are kind of flowing out of Washington's deep concerns about the country and hopes also for the country. Surely some other people have some
Thank you for that.
pushback.
I can throw another question in. I'm curious
I might
if,
cold call people. Be ready. I'm sure.
yeah, I'm trying to defuse some cold calling here. So I'm curious too if kind of the spirit of amity that you describe during the convention, this sharing meals, sharing kind of camaraderie together. Have you noticed if that was shared in the behaviors of the early Congresses as Congress actually meets in New York and Philadelphia?
That's as historians, I like to say sometimes that might be a little bit
Sure.
outside
Mhm.
my zone of
Okay.
specialty. So I haven't really looked as much into that. I mean, I can report on like the something that gets a little closer to that period, which is the celebrations when the
Mhm.
Constitution is actually ratified in the spring of 1788. It's so fun reading about these kind of big parades and fireworks that are kind of set off in every state when every state kind of ratifies the Constitution, especially on the 4th of July. And of course, there's some knucklehead who actually like lights off some fireworks and gets killed.
Mhm.
So we actually have a casualty in the creation of the Constitution just from that, human nature. Um, and they're definitely emphasizing they're having these huge feasts, and they're making a point of bringing like, farmers into like the parades. They would always have the farmers lead the way in these parades to kind of emphasize the people who likely disagree, criticize the Constitution and weren't so sure about the Constitution. We want to kind of emphasize them, and they would have these meals where, even at that point, hierarchy in American society was still a thing in 1787, 88, but it was starting to break down. And Gordon Wood has really nicely shown how that happened from the American Revolution on. But it was still there. So that stood out to people that at these feasts and bacchanalias and banquets, they made a point of having people from up and down the kind of the social strata eat side by side with each other and together. And for them, that was actually such a point of contrast between feasts and festivals and banquets and parades in Europe, which they were aware of either from firsthand experience or from kind of stories that where those parades would always have a singular focus on the leader, the king, and there would be tight, kind of obvious social stratification. In these, there was not that. There was a self-conscious attempt to kind of break away from that, which was also, I think, in this concept of the spirit of amity. And some anti-federalists who voted against the Constitution found, wow, these farewell parties or these ratification parties are so fun. I'm actually inclined to sort of, lean in the direction of supporting the Constitution by virtue of the behavior of the Federalists towards us during these celebrations, which was so kind of, polite and kind of kind and generous. But
Very
sorry,
interesting.
Cortland, yeah, that's
Yeah.
more on that period. I don't really have a lot to say about the Congresses.
Well, that does actually lead into kind of a similar-ish question that I had was kind of with this spirit of amity in popular culture, and I think you hit on that a bit with incorporating farmers into parades and kind of this idea. But with the cover letter, as you mentioned, it was distributed with the printings of the constitutions that wouldn't have just been read by the drafters or the participants in the ratifying conventions, but the members of the literate public at large, those who had access to newspapers and were able to kind of see Washington's letter as it was printed. And I'm curious if there's kind of any popular indication of amity as kind of this constitutional and Republican sort of culture
Oh,
that's
I just lost your
emerged.
volume.
Oh no. I'm curious
Hey, Cortland,
if can you
sorry,
hear me at all?
Hmm.
Oh no.
I'm not hearing you anymore.
Can anyone else hear me?
Oh, now I can hear. Now I got you.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, I'm curious if kind of as this kind of early Republican culture is emerging, if the spirit of amity is kind of limited to, if we see that limited to the leaders of that early republic, or if it kind of manifests as part of this culture at large.
Hmm. Um, well, I think you see it like in at least in the state ratifying conventions, you see the behavior shift, from Pennsylvania, where the Pennsylvania Federalists are kind of really tough and kind of have this sort of hardball approach to the Anti-Federalists, and the Anti-Federalists hate them as a result. Um, to a different style in Massachusetts and Virginia and New York, where the Federalists allow for full debate. They allow for the printing of dissenting opinions in the state journal. They allow for thousands, literally thousands of people attended and watched these conventions. They were like good political drama. It was like good theater, frankly. Um, and men and women would kind of pack into these rooms and watch the speakers. Um, and Anti-Federalists would comment often after like they concluded, like say the Massachusetts ratifying convention up in Boston in like February 1788. Like, wow, the people like who, these were anti-federalists speaking, interacting with like merchants and kind of and the more well-to-do people in Boston, that they had never been treated so politely as they had been in Boston. They were on their better behavior, I think in some of the later state ratifying conventions, especially because those state ratifying conventions were so close. Like, and I didn't mention that, but in each of those three states I mentioned, Massachusetts, Virginia, and New York, the numbers were such that in the beginning, the Anti-Federalists outnumbered the Federalists. And so they knew they had an uphill climb. And all three of those states were critical. If you lost Massachusetts, the Constitution is gone. It's over. And you have to, maybe you get a second convention, and so the stakes were higher. And so people did try to sort of behave a little bit more kindly. Maybe one example of this, there was one very famous anti-federalist named Elbridge Gerry, who's now famous for like the gerrymander. But he was a critic of the Constitution up in Massachusetts. He had been in the Philadelphia Constitutional Convention. He ran as a delegate for the Massachusetts Convention and lost, which was a blow to him. But the Federalists allowed his presence at the convention regardless. They said, he's a big figure. He was an eyewitness to the convention. We will let him come. And so that was a display of kind of like, a sense of sort of fair play or kind of, a moderation in a way that I think the Anti-Federalists sort of appreciated and respected. There was other cases of like Federalists visiting Anti-Federalists at taverns or even in a hospital at one point. So they're making more efforts to do that. But so I guess I'm speaking more to kind of the way the Federalists were kind of responding and behaving, less so the Anti-Federalists. It's hard to know, the behavior. And there were different kinds of like Anti-Federalists. Like there were much tougher guys who I write about, who were just really bloody toothed and were just really pissed off and alienated by the kind of what they saw as basically a coup by the moneyed elite, and they let them have it. But there was another group of anti-federalists who I'm calling them more moderate anti-federalists, who were actually indispensable, truly practically electorally indispensable to the ratification of the Constitution. They were the guys who brought people over in Massachusetts and Virginia and New York. I mentioned them already: Sam Adams, Melancton Smith. Like Melancton Smith, for instance, from New York, brought 12 other anti-federalists over. Initially, the Federalists were outnumbered, I think 19 to 40 in the state ratifying convention. And Smith brought over 12 anti-federalists and wound up getting a ratification 30 to 27. And so you do have, so you've got the harder core anti-federalists, but then you have a form of moderates that I think are responding to the reasoned or attempts at reasoned arguments from the Federalists and responding in kind to that. So hope that's at least something of an answer to your good question.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I see us moving closer to the hour-and-a-half mark. I love that we have been so engaged, but I do want to cut the questions off there. Okay. Thank you so much, Professor Webb. And I felt it was, and actually thank you, Cortland, for asking those questions, because it bought me some time to pull up what I think is the perfect end to this event, our closing ritual. So, there being no further business to come before the Reading chapter, please rise, but don't actually rise because we're virtual. We have gathered here to advance in this meeting the principles and ideals of Phi Alpha Delta. Before we began, we directed our minds to the noble purpose of our fraternity. In closing, let us lay aside any differences of opinion that may have arisen. Elsewhere, they may breed hard feelings and discord, but not so with us. For us, they are and must forever be forgotten in that bond of fraternalism, Phi Alpha Delta, which we all share. I now declare this meeting of the Robert E. Reading National Capital Area Alumni Chapter of Phi Alpha Delta adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel, John, Cortland, and everybody else. Peggy, Michael, Trong, Jay. Thank you for joining. It's been fun to kind of chat with you guys.
Thank you. It's Pega, not Peggy.
Excuse me, I'm sorry about that.
That's okay. It's very nice to see you again, Professor Webb. I know we met last year, I believe. Cardozo Chapter's initiation. I'm the District Justice of District 23.
Very good. All right.
Yeah, this has been wonderful.
Thank you. Let me stop the recording.
Thank you so much.